Okay. I was just waiting something.
No?
Okay, good afternoon then. After the coffee break, we have this extended session on international trade. This was one of the topics that we were discussing when we were planning, or at least I was just connecting with the chats that once a month Alex was organizing, and one of the topics that we have quite clear that would be interesting to celebrate is kind of 2 decades, the 20th anniversary of the Arnoldshain seminar, and one of the topics also that has been present in many of these conferences and seminars was international trade. And international trade related with globalization, with development, because in fact we wanted to find topics that had developed during these 20 years and have changed according to the developments also of this process of international relations. And having chosen the topic, we began to think in people to participate, in this case in a session that will combine a keynote speech and a roundtable. And trade, development are 2 words that appear constantly in the curriculum and the words of the first participant in terms of the time that and one of the people that is in this table, that is Sangeeta, Professor Sangeeta Khorana. Sangeeta, well, after 2 days, we know you already. You always prepare the presentation in a very formal way. Now it's a little bit artificial because we know each other already since yesterday. And Sangeeta Khorana has been working for years in topics related with trade, development, the line of research connected with agreements, bilateral agreements, preferential agreements, also related with developing countries, with India, country of origin, and she holds a PhD from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and the last years has been in Lisbon, in Kiel, and now at the University of Bordeaux. So thank you, Sangeeta, for accepting our invitation to give this keynote speech and to participate in the roundtable. And together also, and closely related the work with trade and working in an institution in the European Union and inside the European Union in the DG Trade is Lars Nilsson. Thank you again, Lars, to having accepted to come. Lars is a Swedish national, many years already in the European in Brussels, in the European Commission. First he was in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the Swedish Foreign Affairs Ministry, and since I think 2002 has been in the European Commission as a trade economist. He was educated in the Lund University, not University in Germany, I don't know, in Skåne. Universitet, okay, Universitet. Lund, my first word in Swedish. Lunds Universitet, and he's a PhD also in economics in that university, and has been also connected with the University of California, Santa Barbara. And the last one, not least, of course, my colleague, Inma. Inma is very well known in the Arnoldshain seminar. Sometimes there are sessions that all the papers are No, it's true. I think Inma is a very close friend. We began together to work in the University Jaume I. I would go to say many years ago, but not many years ago because she's very young. And since then, well, she has been developing an academic career that to me makes me very, very happy to have been at least being in the moment that she was just connected to the university and she came to the University of the Jaume in Castellón. But of course, in the last years, she's more in Germany than in Castellón, and she's now in the Göttingen University, and well, continues to be connected with the Institute of International Economics, and she has been working also very, very intensively and extensively in topics of related to trade, environment, preferences. And I forgot to say that in this sense, Lars is also, has also concentrated a part of his job in the trade unit in the European Commission. I would say that being an analyst there has produced a lot of academic work related with preferences, trade agreements, and protection, basically from the point of view of the Europe. So, we have more or less 2 hours in front of us, a little bit less. But well, how we are going to organize the session, I think that, well, we have a keynote speech. We will begin with the keynote speech by Sangeeta, with the time that you consider adequate, and afterwards we can, after there are questions directly related with the presentation of Sangeeta, we can just open the roundtable with presentations by Lars. Well, of course, Sangeeta has a short presentation also in the roundtable. Lars and Inma, and after all the presentations, we'll open the table and the discussion to everybody. And well, we think that we'll be around 6 and tired enough to relax a little bit, and afterwards having a nice dinner, and I don't know what more.
Something with Caro.
But well,
ballroom dancing.
Okay, thank you. So let's start, Sangeeta, with your keynote.
Thank you so much. I would really like to express my appreciation to you, Celes, for the kind introduction. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have been interacting with you since yesterday, and it's a pleasure. Thank you once again to the organizers for having invited me to this esteemed forum. Let me begin by highlighting that global trade is at a very challenging moment, and yet it is very exciting at this point in time. And let me explain, let me just go into detail and explain why it is a paradox of these two things. First, it's challenging because global exports have stalled. Latest data from the OECD shows that trade figures for the first quarter have been exceptionally bad for most countries. It has also revealed more fundamental differences in that the G7 countries' exports haven't recovered. Rather, exports are going sideways and have now started to decline. It is true that for BRICS, trade has exceeded pre-crisis level. But if we take China out of the equation, then all other BRIC countries have not seen their trade recovery. So something is fundamentally changing with the dynamics of international trade, which was not a feature earlier on. And I would like to talk about why that is and what we can do about this. How can we rectify this problem? The sluggish growth of trade is mainly attributed to the change in the structure of trade, as we are aware. We know that it's been driven primarily by global supply chains in the past few years, which has many staging points in production and distribution networks. But the fact is that these are not developing as they did in the past. And this has actually created a problem. What is happening is that China is importing less than exporting. And the share of imported component in Chinese exports has shrunk considerably. This is also again then being reflected in FDI trends and taking production to other countries. Further, there has also been slowing down in the pace of offshoring in the West. So global trade has not grown as fast as global GDP, and this is where the structural problem is coming in. While trade has been going through its ups and downs in the past years, we see yet another important development, and that is the decline in international liberalization attempts of the trading system. In the past, liberalization had received shocks in the arm through the Uruguay round and the NAFTA. Sadly enough, WTO has not been able to rejuvenate trade as much in the past few years. Basically, we have been coasting on the back of multilateral liberalization that we saw in 1990s and 2000s. And we haven't seen anything of that magnitude in the past few years. So this has encouraged a mushrooming of bilateral trade agreements and regional trade agreements. But the sad part of the whole story is that there is an incoherence between these developments, i.e. regional trade agreements, and the financial architecture. So I'll talk about this a little later, and I'll just elaborate on that. The next challenge of globalization then are job losses. And we are all aware that job losses have been an ongoing feature for a few years, and in addition to this, there's also been a downward pressure on wages, and working conditions have also been adversely impacted. We hear in the news time and time again about how bad working conditions are for labor. There are also anxieties that increased competition from low-wage countries has put excessive pressure on local producers and workers, and these have resulted in closures or partial closures of factories at home, and some of these have been relocated abroad. While these concerns are not new and understandable, they seem to have been heightened by the rapid emergence of China and India on the world scene. In particular, the widespread use of information technology increasingly has eroded boundaries between what can and what cannot be traded, which has had an impact on wages. So there are the two sides of globalization that we are seeing here. One more challenge I would like to draw your attention to is that finding an adequate response to globalization may be seen as a part of the broader policy challenge that we face being a dynamic economy. That is, we need to understand how is it that economies can cope with the structural economic change that is undergoing. And to reap the benefits from globalization, it is necessary to undergo a process of adjustment of factors of production, such as capital, because it moves from activities and firms that cannot withstand the increased competition. In addition, there is structural adjustment also, because labor is rigid and capital and product markets are becoming more and more costly and adjustment is becoming more complicated and painful. So as a result of all this happening at the global level, some countries have been going and doing unilateral agreements, i.e. bilateral agreements, to increase their flow of FDIs and for building supply chains, as well as, in addition to all this, they have also to give boost to their exports, they have come up with the special economic zones, which we may like to reflect on as we go along. Now let me talk, so these were the challenges, a few challenges that I have laid out and we can discuss in detail again. Now let me talk about the exciting part of it, and this is what all three of us work on. It's basically related to regional trade agreements and how this is actually changing the geography of the world. No doubt we have all followed the choreography of trade agreements and mega deals, such as TTIP, TPP and RCEP. And these are the three main major deals that are all over, are being discussed in all circles. The question and it's really very exciting, it's a challenge, but yet it is very exciting because we need to sit back and reflect, what does this trigger? What do these trade agreements trigger in terms of other negotiations? What will be the reaction of the other countries that are outside, for example, TPP or RCEP? What's going to be the impact on those? Does it mean that these mega trade agreements that we've started negotiating, will it mean that we know TTIP is slipping, TPP is slipping? Does it mean that there'll be a concerted effort and the US and other partners would like to conclude before the November deadline? And I say November deadline, which they have set for themselves because we've got the ministerial in the middle of December. This really is going to have implications for the WTO. So non-conclusion or conclusion of TPP will have major implications for the world trading system. So we need to think back and we need to sit back and think, how is TPP going to have an impact on the future of global trade? What will be the impact on WTO? Will it survive? Will it come out as a very powerful institution, or will it just go into oblivion if mega trade deals become the order of the day? So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a very exciting moment because I do work on trade agreements. An important question that is being discussed is whether RTAs and region-to-region liberalization can make a difference in the short term. And I suppose all of you will agree with me and say, yes, I guess there could be a difference in the short term. But if we look into the crystal ball, I don't think any one of us or any econometrician can actually come back and come up with a very conclusive answer as to what the implications will be in the longer term, because no one saw this coming, that RTAs would be the order of the day when it was 1997. So another exciting issue that I would like to draw your attention to is the unbundling of the demand and supply equations of international trade. This is an area that we do not talk about often, but the more I think, the more I analyze data, the more it comes to me, well, there are structural problems, and well, it's very exciting. It's again a challenge as well. And I think that there is a mismatch between the demand and supply equations of international trade, which is why we have got into this problem. If we start digging into this issue, we see that the problem today is the demand equation. In that, the upside and the downside of globalization have not been shared. And you will all agree with me as I will elaborate on what I mean. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that savings in East Asia are there, right? But it's not the case in OECD countries. I mean, in OECD countries, saving rates are very low. So this then means East Asia has a surplus of savings, but this cannot be translated into demand in OECD countries, i.e. the developed world. If we analyze trade data further, we find that 90% of the gains from trade in the past 5 years have actually been reaped by the 1% top countries, which are the OECD countries. So here we see that there is an inherent mismatch between the demand and supply. Savings are increasing in one part of the world, and well, if savings are increasing, demand has to increase. The demand isn't increasing. So this has brought us to a very exciting phase that we need to understand. How is it that we are going to unbundle the demand and supply chains to make sure that we are able to ensure that there is balanced growth of trade and that benefits are reaped by all countries. So another aspect I would like to draw your attention to is the global financial structure. The problem is that the current global financial structure is not designed to encourage saving by rich countries. On the contrary, the focus, and each one of us knows, is on increasing productivity. And I'm sure you will all agree with me. We just focus on increasing productivity. We do not suggest ways and means by which we can look at the demand and supply equations. So this is basically a problem. This then means that OECD economies really need to think in terms of restructuring their demand and supply sides. If we turn our attention to the 2008 crisis, then we will all agree on the extent of damage that systemic incoherence can inflict on economies. And this seriously disrupted the trading environment, and we are still feeling the effect now. The environment remains challenging today, particularly for poorer and vulnerable economies. Talking about vulnerable economies, we all know that 2050 is a big year in the Sustainable Development Calendar. It's written all over the place, Rio +20, and we are talking about sustainable development goals, how they will be financed. We are discussing this at the multilateral level. So according to the post-2050 development framework, we have to think much more in much more concrete terms. What can countries do collectively as a whole to support inclusive and sustainable outcomes? Because poorer countries and vulnerable economies are being left out in this game. All gains are being reaped by, most gains are being reaped by the economies which are either better integrated and who are richer. Doing so will require clear guidance on how trade fits into that framework and to suggest ways how incoherence between the international financial architecture and trading system can be addressed. Further, we also need to address systemic biases and asymmetries which continue to impede the full sharing of gains from increased trade flows. We know trade has increased, but still there are biases, there are asymmetries, and hence gains are not being distributed equally. So benefits of globalization are not being reaped by all economies across the world. Given the deficit in trust at the multilateral level, and this is clearly being reflected through inaction at the WTO level, bolder thinking is required as to how we will make the system more participatory. And how is it that countries will once more start talking in terms of multilateral liberalization rather than just going down the bilateral liberalization. In such a context, openness to the world is very essential. And if there is no openness, globalization will not actually deliver the benefits of trade and liberalization. Only by engaging actively and consistently with global partners can we hope to shape the future of the world where globalization will bring its benefits. So this then takes me to the point to suggest that different combinations of fiscal and monetary as well as exchange rate policies are required. But then these have to be complemented with industrial and technological policies, i.e. we have to increase productivity, but we have to make sure that trade that is being generated is harnessed in a manner that it leads to sustainable development. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that sustainable development is really the buzzword of the day now. So for this, states must be willing to experiment with policy choices. But at the same time, they should be ready to cede a bit of their national sovereignty in support of a stable and open trading system, which then again means, well, the big question looming in front of us is, will WTO be able to win over the faith of the countries worldwide and bring them back to the negotiating table? Or the big question is, will we be stuck in mega regional deals? Where are we going to go? In my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we look at this point to two main developments that are going to happen in the next few months. One, we'll have the EU unfurling its trade policy at the end of October. So that's going to give an indication as to where one big global power is taking the world. In addition to that, we'll have the WTO ministerial immediately after, which will be in 5-6 weeks from then. So these two major developments in 2015 will charter the course of all economies in the world. Let me conclude by saying we live in a world that becomes more integrated every day. When Marshall McLuhan said that human family now exists under conditions of a global village, he said this in 1962. So if he had this perception in 1962, you can imagine what he would say in 2050. Yeah? So it's really hard to conceive what he might think of international connections and the kind of connectivity we have today. I will leave it to you to debate on this kind of interconnections that we have, what are the linkages between trade and development. These are just a few thoughts that I had on trade and development and where we are actually going in terms of trade within the broader context of globalization. So thank you so much, and I'll be very willing to take on questions and discuss as we go along.
Okay, so we can have questions to the open lines and open fields that Sangeeta has exposed, or we can continue with presentations and accumulating interventions, whatever you like. If there is some intervention now, specific intervention, or can we continue and enriching the... Let's continue, and then we will be able to tackle things in a more coherent and more integrated way.
Because I think everyone is still awake. In the next 1 hour that might not be the case.
Okay. Lars, so you have now the floor. Thank you.
The first option, 20 Arno.
Sorry?
Perfect.
Probably you... I'm just...
No, it's okay.
It's fine.
Okay, you can see, okay? Without,
Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Lars. I come from the Commission's Trade Department, and I'd like to thank the organizers very much for bringing me to Arnoldshain. It's my first time here, and it's very nice to be here. I like the forest. I had a nice walk this morning. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is, when you see it on the slide, I'm going to compare EU-US trade policies towards developing countries.
Microphone, please.
And why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because you know that trade has become, well, even though we have a slowdown in trade lately, but over the past 20 years we've seen a substantial increase in trade, and the ratio of world exports to world GDP, I think that's increased like from 15% to up to 25%. So trade can be a powerful engine for poverty reduction. It can improve living conditions, working conditions. And the EU and the US, together with China, are the largest imports of goods from developing countries. And since the EU and the US have had preferential trading arrangements in place for developing countries for quite some time, I thought it would be interesting to take a comparative look at how the EU and the US are treating developing countries. But in fact, that is not the only reason. I also saw this some years ago, where The Economist said that the American African Growth and Opportunity Act, this is what everybody else should apply because this is great. And then you see academics, in this case Paul Collier, saying that comparing the US African Growth and Opportunity Act, and come back to what this is, with the EU's Everything But Arms initiative, saying that what the Europeans do, well, it's worse than useless. So yeah, of course, that triggered some interest. Is this really the case? Are we really doing so poorly compared to the Americans? So this is what I'm going to show you. So what you have here on the left-hand side, you have the EU's main preferential trading schemes for developing countries. Above the dotted line, you have unilateral preferences, where you have the generalized system of preferences, which in fact consists of 3 different schemes. Consists of standard GSP, something called GSP Plus, where beneficiaries have to adhere to human rights and labor conventions, ILO conventions, and human rights and good governance. I think there are 27 conventions in total that have to be ratified and implemented. We have the Everything But Arms initiative for LDCs, which provides for duty-free and quota-free access for all goods from LDCs into the EU market except for arms. Arms, not arms, weapons. On the right-hand side, you have the US. Well, I should say on the left-hand side, below the dotted lines, you have reciprocal arrangements where we have free trade agreements with developing countries. That is, not only the EU is opening up, but also these countries have to open up. And the economic partnership agreements have been concluded with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And then we have other FTAs here. I took the most recent ones, but of course we have Mexico, Chile, and South Africa, which were concluded some 10, 15 years ago. On the US side, they also have a generalized system of preferences. And they have a specific generalized system of preferences for LDCs. And on my next slide, I'm going to go a little bit more into detail of what's the big difference between these schemes. And then they have the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which applies to 39, the regular AGOA, in fact, 3 AGOAs, just to make life a little bit more complicated, just as we do with our GSP. The regular AGOA covers 39 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, 27 LDCs, and 12 developing countries. Then there's the called AGOA clothing, which specific preferences in the textiles and clothing sector. And then you have AGOA under the subcategory of AGOA clothing, which is the special apparel rule, where there are relaxed rules of origin for those countries who want to export clothing duty free to the US. Then, of course, the Americans also have bilateral free trade agreements like the Caribbean Basin Initiative and the Energy and Preference Act. Now, if we look a little bit closer to this, I here have a slide on the coverage. And this is the share of dutiable tariff lines. So when the tariff is 0, when everybody's facing a 0 tariff, when we say that the end-to-end tariff is 0, that's not included here. So what's left are only dutiable lines. So in the standard UGSP, we have a coverage of almost 90%. The 90 plus 54 countries, it's a little bit complicated to explain. In fact, the scheme covers 90 countries today, it was reformed not too long ago. The 54 countries are other developing countries which are covered by better schemes than the GSP. So in fact, if they wouldn't have had these other schemes, they would also come under the GSP. The GSP Plus covers 13 countries, even though I think I saw a mentioning of 15 countries. This is being updated, countries can apply throughout the year. And then you add additional coverage for the LDCs to come up to 99.6% when you take out just arms, that's it. So 99.6% of all duty tariff lines, that's what the EU can provide, at least for the least developed countries, which have the most preferential arrangement there is. On the US side, the coverage is somewhat lower, 47% for the standard GSP. There's additional coverage for some specific countries, adding another 4.5%, and then they also add substantial coverage under their LDC program, the GSP LDC. Under the US AGOA, you add additional products, but in total you add up with AGOA clothing to 85%, while the EU on their side has almost full coverage. I should say though that under the EU standard GSP, the rule is that you reduce tariffs. You reduce the NFN tariff by 3.5 percentage points, which means that it may not necessarily be zero duty access to the EU market. But on the other hand, for most products, the EU has quite low tariffs, so in many cases it is. On the US side, what's covered is zero duty. They don't have any partial reduction, so to that extent they can fight what the EU does. Now next I'm going to compare, because of the Economist quote and because of what academics say about AGOA and the EU's Everything But Arms initiative, I'm going to first have you see some descriptive statistics on EU and US imports from LDCs, and then on EU and US imports from the AGOA beneficiaries. You can see here that the total trade value is about similar. It's about 20 billion. These figures are back from 2010. On the other hand, the EU, we have a much larger share of MFN zero imports. We are more open than what the Americans are, almost 50%. What's then eligible, that's what's not MFN zero, what is dutiable. For the LDCs, everything they export to us, because they don't export arms here, so we have 100% coverage, which, well, maybe I actually just rounded 99.6 up to 100, I don't remember, but it's almost full coverage. The Americans at 74.4%. We have a higher preference utilization rate, and in the end that actually means that the actual duty-free trade that the LDC sent to us is 92.3% of whatever the LDCs export to the EU comes in duty-free, which corresponds to almost 20%, 20 billion we have. And then you may ask yourself, so why could it be that there are not full preference utilization rate? Yes. It could be, you say that a good comes from Bangladesh, but the Bangladeshis have to prove that the good actually comes from Bangladesh. If there's too much Chinese input into this good, it will not be counted as a Bangladeshi good, and then it will not be granted the preferential treatment. So this is indicated for the LDCs. We take a look at the indicators for the AGOA beneficiaries. You see imports of summer tire, 50 billion. Again, we have a higher share of MFN0 imports. We see that both for the EU and the US, eligible for duty-free treatment is almost 100%. Again, the preference utilization rate is higher in the EU than in the US, and we have a higher share of actual duty-free trade coming from the AGOA beneficiaries. So, I think it's fair to say that the EU is more open to LDCs and it's more open to the AGOA beneficiaries. And I don't want to bore you with one other descriptive slide, but on the next descriptive slide, in fact, when we look at only the sub-category of AGOA clothing, there we are on par with the Americans. We're not much better in any sense. Some indicators even somewhat higher on the US side. So, in that sense, AGOA clothing with relaxed rules of origin, you can say it has worked, and many papers have in fact shown that it does work. But what is often forgotten is that these preferences, which applies to 27 AGOA clothing, applies to that with a special apparel rule, applies to 26 countries. 4 countries account for 90% of all exports. So while I think relaxed rules of origin are very important, it's not enough. You need actually more to help countries generate We ran some econometrics on this, and it shows, in fact, what we saw visually, that EU trade policy have generated more exports from LDCs, and it has generated more exports from the AGOA countries. It hosts both the dutiable and duty-free trade. So my conclusion on this part, before I have 2 more slides, is going to be that yes, the AGOA scheme is good, but no, I'm not sure it's the very best scheme, and this is the scheme that everybody should copy, as was suggested initially. Now, we know that a unilateral preferential scheme can only do so much, and so much is in fact only reduce tariffs. Issues and problems are often much more complicated than that. And one of the proposals from the EU has been vis-à-vis the ACP countries to introduce what we call economic partnership agreements. And these are reciprocal agreements with asymmetric liberalization, meaning that also the partner country will have to open up. On the other hand, I put here asymmetric liberalization, meaning that when the EU opens up from day 1 to provide free access, duty-free, quota-free access for all products, the partner country will have to open up in 15, 20, 25 years. And while we open up 100%, they have carve-outs of 20, 25% of tariff lines. So there is a scope for them to protect industries that they consider to be vital and they consider to be important, that they consider are in need of protection. But this setup with the economic partnership agreements also provides for, of course, an institutional structure where things can be discussed and where we can provide development cooperation assistance to the countries. And we can, since these agreements are concluded in most cases regionally, we can also try to set up rules on a regional basis. And of course, if you're an investor and you face the same rules in an entire region compared to different rules in each country, it may make a difference. And then, finally, I want to mention a few issues that have been discussed quite substantially, I would say, when it comes to the economic partnership agreements. But these issues, they're very difficult to quantify. What's the impact? But I still want to mention them because I think they're important. I mentioned rules and governance just previously. I think that is important. In terms of competition, what the EU wants to achieve with competition vis-à-vis these countries is not an EU-like competition policy, but maybe some minimal structures trying to get rid of monopolies in some of the countries where they actually cause some harm. When it comes to procurement, the idea again from the EU side is not to get market access into the procurement markets of these countries. It is rather transparency. Why not publish openly what these countries' authorities buy from whom and to what price? Simple transparency measure could have a huge impact in terms of fighting corruption, etc. Finally, on services, I think it's often forgotten that the good today is not only a good. A good contains a lot of services, depending on what good it is. But You have research design to start with, then you have the production phase, you have logistics, you have transports again, you have after-sales service, depending again on what kind of good it is. But it could be that you don't reap the full benefits of goods liberalization unless you do something on services as well. And it would be a pity to forego such opportunities. So anyway, this is where I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lars. Martin, you turn.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to continue with a very much related topic to the unilateral preferences. Now I'm going to move to bilateral preferences, but instead of focusing on trade, I'm going to focus on the new generation of regional trade agreements that include not only as a main issue trade, but also other aspects that could influence also not only trade outcomes, but also labor conditions in different countries or environmental quality in different countries. Then it is very important to notice that agreements that have been signed in the late 90s and especially in the 2000s, many of those agreements, they are deep and comprehensive trade agreements. That means that they include much more than trade. And I am not going to focus on many of the issues like investment, like procurement and services and so on. I'm only going to focus on two aspects, which are the labor provisions and the environmental provisions that are included in the new generation of regional trade agreements. If you want, we could call them economic integration agreements, to be more general, but then it's difficult to come to a consensus about what to use. Regional, because sometimes these agreements are not anymore regional, they involve different regions in the world, but then in this presentation I'm using this RPA as a general notation for economic integration agreements. Then, as I said before, most of the recent agreements, especially the North-South agreements, include a number of provisions, among them labor and environmental provisions. In some ways they include specific chapters, and in some other cases they only mention the issues in the preamble, or in some other cases they have side agreements. The main question is, should environmental and labor issues be part of the negotiations, or should be better tackled in other forums like the ILO for labor, or let's say the COP, Paris 2050 for environmental issues. You know that the Kyoto Agreement in a way failed because there is no continuation after 2012, but still countries are not able to agree in reductions in emissions and other issues related to the environment. And the ILO, again, is also not succeeding completely in incorporating, for example, the US. The US is not ratifying many of the conventions of the ILO, and this is in a way a failure of the multilateral system. I think for this reason, many North countries, let's say the US and the European Union, they are encouraging, well, when they negotiate agreements.
No? Okay, good afternoon then. After the coffee break, we have this extended session on international trade. This was one of the topics that we were discussing when we were planning, or at least I was just connecting with the chats that once a month Alex was organizing. And one of the topics that we have quite clear that would be interesting to celebrate is kind of the 2 decades, 20th anniversary of the Arnoldshain seminar, and one of the topics also that has been present in many of these conferences and seminars was international trade. An international trade related with globalization, with development, because in fact we wanted to find topics that had developed during these 20 years and have changed according to the developments also of this process of international relations. And having chosen the topic, we began to think in people to participate, in this case, in a session that will combine a keynote speech and a roundtable. And trade development are two words that appears constantly in the curriculum and the words of the first participant in terms of the time that and one of the people that is in this table, that is Sangeeta, Professor Sangeeta Khorana. Sangeeta, well, after 2 days, we know you already. You always prepare the presentation in a very formal way. Now it's a little bit artificial because we know each other already since yesterday. And Sangeeta Khorana has been working for years in topics related with trade, development, the line of research connected with agreements, bilateral agreements, preferential agreements, also related with developing countries, with India, country of origin, and she holds a PhD from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and the last years has been in Lisbon, in Kiel, and now at the University of Born. So thank you, Sangeeta, for accepting our invitation to give this keynote speech and to participate in the roundtable. And together also, and closely related the work with trade and working in an institution in the European Union and inside the European Union in the DG Trade is Lars Nilsson. Thank you again, Lars, to having accepted to come. Lars is a Swedish national, many years already in the European in Brussels, in the European Commission. First, he was in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the Swedish Foreign Affairs Ministry, and since, I think, 2002, has been in the European Commission as a trade economist. He was educated in the Lund University, not University in Germany, I don't know, in Scotland. Universitet, okay, Universitet. Lund, my first word in Swedish. Lunds Universitet, and he's a PhD also in economics in that university, and has been also connected with the University of California, Santa Barbara. And the last one, not least, of course, my colleague, Inma. Inma is very well known in the Arnoldshain seminar. Sometimes there are sessions that all the papers are on. No, it's true. I think Inma is a very close friend. We began together to work in the University of Primaire. I would go to say many years ago, but not many years ago because she's very young. And since then, well, she has been developing an academic career that makes me very, very happy to have been at least being in the...
So some agreements, they refer to this, some others, they only refer to national laws. The second aspect is monitoring and cooperation issues and technical assistance, especially for labor provisions. And some agreements are more specific in these aspects, or others are more general. And the dispute resolution and sanctions is another important aspect in which many agreements differ. And even though the US has used those sanctions in the main text of the agreement, they have never been applied. Only there were some claims for Guatemala, but then they are still in the panel, and then it takes many, many years, and then those sanctions, they will materialize if they eventually materialize, but still there is no any real case of sanction. And with environmental provisions, of course, we have also many multilateral environmental agreements, as we will see in another slide. And only a few bilateral or regional trade agreements refer to the prevalence of the multilateral environmental agreements above what is included in the regional trade agreements. So there are some lack of coherence in between the multilateral system and also what is contained in the trade agreements. And again, dispute resolution in both cases, in labor provisions and environmental provisions, some cases when there are disagreements or countries don't comply with what is in the provisions. The latest agreements, they mainly refer to the main mechanism for dispute resolutions, but the earlier agreements, they refer to specific panels. I won't go very much into the details of these examples. I have this slide for US agreements with labor or environmental provisions, and the next one for examples for the European Union. What I wanted to say in general, as if you see the bold words, you will see that the referral to international standards says requires to enforce, and so on. And this refers mainly to national laws. So the agreements say you have to respect the laws you have in your own country with respect to labor, or in some cases environmental laws. And in some cases, in the later agreements after 2000, after the agreement with Jordan, which is not mentioned there, they refer also the US agreement to the ILO, but to the declaration, 1998 declaration, but not to the conventions. This is an important difference with respect to the EU agreement. And in general, after the NAFTA, all of them include specific chapters, and those aspects are in the main text of the trade agreements. Again, they also, in the scope and content, you will see this wording, strive to ensure, or the latest agreement, the two later agreements, not fail to effectively enforce. So they are rewording a bit more the way in which they want to tackle the. But in general, what they want, the US, that the labor conditions or the environmental standards are respected at the national level, and they are not going to be lowered to counterbalance more preferences. And some of them impose also fines, as you can see in the two first agreements. Going to the European Union approach, in general, they refer to social cooperation, trade and sustainable development. Then they are a bit more general. The wording is more recognizing the right of each party, of the importance of environmental standards or social development. Also, in some cases, human rights are mentioned. So they are more general, and they are more offering cooperation and support. And only the latest agreement, or the CETA with Canada, which is being negotiated, they refer to the general dispute settlement procedure. Before, there were specific panels concerning the enforcement of the agreement. So, as you can see, the approaches are different, and starting with the EU-Mexico in 2000, actually in this one there were no specific chapters, only direct mentions in different parts of the agreement. Even though it seems as if the US is more strict than the EU, it doesn't mean that it's going to be more effective, the way in which they include those provisions. Then going now to the multilateral side. What happened concerning environmental protection? There are more than 700 multilateral environmental agreements, if we want to be very general and include protocols, amendments, and treaties. But if we go only to treaties that are in force, they are around 250 to 300. So it's huge, the amount of treaties. And examples are the Kyoto Protocol, the Montreal Protocol that we saw something about it yesterday, and other for species and so on. So there are many concerning pollutants, concerning preservation of many species, or increasing protection of habitats. So it's huge the amount of agreements that we can find. However, only in a few regional agreements, NAFTA and the agreements of Canada with Chile, Colombia, and Costa Rica, and Mexico, Chile, only in these cases is specifically stated that in case of conflict, the multilateral agreements prevail. So the international law will prevail. The other agreements, they don't say anything. Concerning the ILO, which is the multilateral or the international institution where labor issues should be actually tackled, if we go to the fundamental conventions, that we have these 8 conventions, 2 that refer to freedom of association, another 2 to forced labor, discrimination, another 2, and child labor. It's important to notice that the US only has ratified 2 of the conventions. And it's only another country in the world, I think it's Brunei, that is at the same level as the US. Many other countries, they have ratified many more conventions. EU and Chile, all of them, for example. And here you have a more detailed table. I won't go into this, but what is interesting is that the US, that didn't ratify the convention, is imposing to the developing countries that to sign agreements, in some cases, they have to modify the national labor laws, or even environmental standards. But this is a precondition, so we won't see this in the provisions, because in some cases it was a precondition for the negotiations. Then, conditional versus promotional elements of labor provisions. The experiences tell us that the sanction-based approaches are not very successful, in the sense that, okay, they create some awareness of the problem, but in reality they don't show many positive effects, whereas the incentive-based experiences, a very good one is the EU GSP Plus that we saw before with Lars, and then the US-Cambodia Textile Agreement. These 2 have been successful in improving the conditions of the workers in developing countries. And there are many studies showing these positive results. The promotional-based approach is mainly done by the EU, also show positive effects, for example, concerning the conditions of the workers in Chile. So the graph that you have there, it shows the importance of the conditional versus the promotional approach, and you can see how the picture is changing over time and more going towards this promotional approach. So this is maybe good news. Effectiveness. Are those provisions effective or are not? I think we cannot really say much. In general, we see some evidence of improvements of labor standards at the national level for very specific cases, as I mentioned before, the Cambodia case, but those are very specific for specific countries and agreements, and they depend on the interplay between many different factors, political, social, and economic factors. And the incentive-based elements are also working in some cases, but the problem is that the multi-country evidence is still very scarce. It's difficult to find convincing evidence showing that these provisions are useful. And actually I have been working on these topics on both sides, on the environmental provision side, and also starting to work on the effects of labor provisions in regional trade agreements. And, well, concerning the environmental provisions, at least the results indicate that apparently countries that are members of agreements with those environmental provisions, they tend to have lower CO2 emissions. And they also show convergence in emissions. So in general, this is a good point, but still, this is, as far as I know, the only study trying to find out this for all countries and over time. And now I am working in a study commissioned by the OECD to find out what happened for other pollutants, and also we are going to try to construct an index of the importance of environmental provisions in trade agreements. And the second part, the effects of labor provisions in trade agreements. There are two studies, Heavenly and Kamata, but with inconclusive evidence. Actually, they obtain exactly the opposite. Heavenly, they found that including labor provisions in trade agreements is actually decreasing trade, which is not very good news for the trade, the relationship between trade and growth and for developing countries. But Kamata shows more or less that those labor conditions at least improve the conditions of the workers in the developing countries, but more than in the developing countries, in the middle income countries. So again, inconclusive evidence. And in the study that is still a work in progress and then in which I am working, there I found some convergence in some of the figures that you can claim are important for workers: unemployment benefits, coverage ratio, and severance payments. They seem to converge for countries that belong to those agreements, and then they seem to also converge to a better state. So let's say even in terms of minimum wage with respect to average wage, apparently it's a bit higher for countries participating in those trade agreements with provisions in comparison to the others without provisions. So it's still very, very preliminary. Prospects, just to finish, I think the inclusion of these labor provisions and environmental provisions in trade agreement is a way to tackle some aspects that are not being covered in the multilateral framework, where I think is the right place, and therefore it's still a question whether the multilateral institutions, WTO, ILO, or the UNDP, they are going to realize that they should tackle all these issues at a multilateral level, and not to let them to the bilateral or regional system, and then I think they could do it in a more efficient way. Then, just to conclude, I think coherence is needed in the application of these labor provisions and also environmental provisions, and then it should be good if we can find a way to make these two, the multilateral and the bilateral regional systems, to come together and maybe to come to a consensus and to align the practical application of the different regulations at the national and at the international level. Thank you very much.
Sangeeta, you have something to complete, yes?
Yes.
And with this intervention of Sangeeta, we'll finish the intervention of the participants of the roundtable, and we'll open the general discussion.
Press F5.
Yes. Okay, good afternoon, and finally, it's me again. This topic which I have picked up is a very unconventional kind of a topic. This is a new topic where we're just starting to think about what kind of research can be done. So I think we as economists always go and try to find something that is new, exciting, And I would like to draw your attention to the links between globalization, trade and health. This is very much work in progress, and we are writing some papers, we are trying to compile a database, and eventually we'll come up with a book on that. So it's just trying to scratch at the surface, not really going very deep into it. I really will promise not to bore you. So I'll be talking about what are emerging challenges, what are the research horizons, and I have picked this topic essentially because this is a highly under-researched area in international trade and it merits our attention. Simply put, that's why I thought, yes, we'll talk about something topical when it is 5 o'clock and you all are wanting to escape from the room. So I promised you it won't be for more than 15 minutes. It's because of this research deficit that we picked it up. And most importantly, we decided that we will contribute a database. So we are at it, we don't know when are we going to get to the finish line. Now, all economists understand what is the link between health and development. The nexus is very well understood. I won't spend much time on that, but I'll just draw your attention to the Millennium Development Goals, because the Millennium Development Goals clearly acknowledge the importance of health as a means to development and growth, and it was promised that countries would achieve goals by 2050. But what happened? Some countries made an impressive record, but it wasn't really what we had expected the result would be. So this drives home the issue that health is really important. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been talking about health in the Millennium Development Goals, and this has again been reiterated in the Sustainable Development Goals, where they say that eradication of malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, reducing maternal mortality and child mortality are very important. So clearly they are emphasizing and trying to work out that health is important. But you must be now thinking, but why is she talking about health? We need to stop here and think that we are actually trading goods and services, and investments are being traded in the health sector. And this is something which we are not talking about at the moment. And this is where the whole pitch is. So we need to understand one thing, that policy cannot be developed in isolation. And hence I write here that domestic action is no more sufficient, because we need a coordinated effort, and as we've been talking about sustainable and inclusive development and growth, we want the world to get together, and that's why the Sustainable Development Goals have come up. So we have to view the problem of health being interlinked with trade from a very new perspective. And this new context comes from because we've got multilateral trading rules, but at the same time we've got bilateral trading rules on goods and services which relate to health. There are new actors, NGOs, civil society organizations. We have newer markets, and we have very many more tools at our disposal, which then means that we have to think of new responses to this interlinkage between health and trade. Let me try highlighting what is the economic impact. So, health has an impact, and this is both direct and indirect. I'm not breaking it up into direct and indirect effects, which I know you all will be able to flesh out. Let's look at the economic impact. This economic impact has touched both countries in the north as well as the south. If you look, America has had a problem with food recall because of E. coli. UK had a problem with the BSE, and the implication was nearly 9 billion losses. Go on and see countries in the south: Peru, Tanzania, India, Hong Kong, Malaysia. So these are just the most important ones we've picked up, which really had a major impact. This then drives home that, well, yes, there is a linkage between economic development and health, but at the same time we are missing that link of trade, and this is what we are trying to do. Now let's start putting into context what is the relationship between globalization and health. Now when I talk about globalization, I would like to draw your attention to the WTO, because WTO is a house that houses international rules and institutions. This then means, as a result of these trade rules, countries are able to gain market access into member countries gain market access into other member countries, which then means that there is cross-border flow of goods, services, capital, people, ideas, information. And we are missing that this is happening in health. We only talk about goods, we only talk about services, we talk about investments, but we have never stopped for a second and said, yes, health is very important. Where is health trade? It's somewhere lost in the big picture. Now, this globalization is very complex, and this trade that is happening within the globalized world has an implication, because this has an impact on the national economies, in the sense that it has an impact on the gross domestic product, gross national income, which then means the percentage amount that countries set aside for health financing or health schemes depends directly on the GDP. So the global trade that's happening has an impact on health indirectly also, because the higher is your GDP, the higher is the financing to health. And this is again we are not thinking about. Let's start fleshing out a little more the links. What are the links between globalization and health? As I just explained, we have cross-border transmission of diseases, which then means, yes, health is important, we need to think about it. I just mentioned a second ago about trade. And here I'll draw your attention to the economic shock. So what happened after the crisis, because of the shock, trade went down. When trade went down, GDP started, incomes were going, exports and imports were negatively impacted. This also had an impact on how governments would finance health initiatives within the national domains. Another aspect where we find health and trade being linked and WTO being linked is that WTO rules have an impact on how is it that countries have access to knowledge and technology. IPR comes in here, patents come in here, licensing come in here. Next, again, is marketing of unhealthy food. Now you must be thinking, why marketing? Where is this fitting in? This fits in because being a member of the WTO or bilaterally, when you liberalize, you agree to a set of market access commitments, right? Now what is it that MNCs do? MNCs go out and, well, they are after market access. So once the unhealthy foods reach the end of the product cycle in the developed world, they find access into other markets. And this clearly has negative implications because they are high in saturates, high in sugar content. This can then have an impact on health, which will have again direct and indirect impact on the economy. Again, has an impact on consumption, and globalization has an impact on our lifestyles also, because we are getting increasingly busy. We are not, our children hardly go out and play like we did. Yeah, so we are finding that globalization is having a major impact, not only trade routes, but general globalization is having an impact on trade. Next, trade also impacts in terms of environment, because we see that pollution, we have this problem of CO2 emissions, and there's the environmental degradation. This is something we don't talk about. This has a negative impact on health. Another one, and very topical, is as a result of globalization, we had the Arab Spring. Let's take an example. What did that lead to? A lot of conflict. Yeah, and we have had conflict in the Middle East. That has resulted in a lot of migration. We've got people coming in from all different countries into Europe. So this is going to have an impact on health financing in the EU. So we need to stop here and think, well, trade, health and globalization are very, very closely linked. When we look at the governance of health at the international level, we find there is no coherent framework at the moment. That is what is really missing. We find that WTO talks, that WHO, the World Health Organization, talks about public health. And it says, well, public health is, we will take organized measures to prevent diseases, we will promote health, or we will support measures that will prolong the life of the population as a whole. I.e., the focus on nutrition, on health services, on infectious disease. But hold on, where is trade being done? Trade is being done somewhere else, and that is at the WTO level. So we've got, there again, we've got this massive jungle of GATT, we've got GATTs, we've got products that are being hit by SPS, TBT, we've got TRIPS, so we've got a massive jungle there. So the problem is, that at the international architecture, at the multilateral level, there are these two organizations that the WHO is supposed to be looking after health, WTO is looking after trade, but they're actually not talking to each other. Because they are not talking to each other, this area of research is just being neglected. Areas that fall under the WTO and are closely interlinked with the WHO and WIPO are IPRs, access to drugs, we know that this is a major issue, data exclusivity, patents, differential pricing, anti-counterfeiting protection, compulsory licensing, parallel imports. We have quite a few issues that we can actually start researching on, and these are completely new and untouched areas of research. But why is it we are not doing any research on that? Because we do not have a comprehensive database, that's the problem. And that's where we started thinking, well, it might be an idea, but let's start thinking in terms of contributing a database, just exclusively on the health sector. So we went about, so far we are just into collecting data on health goods. So health is a sector where you have goods, services, and investments. So for goods, what we have done is we've broken them into three groups: Group A, Group B, Group C. Group A are pharmaceutical inputs, and we have grouped them into formulations, bulk medicines, and inputs to the industry. Then Group B, we've got chemical inputs, and these are chemical inputs which are being fed in generally into the health sector. Group C are medical equipment and other inputs, and here we are talking about hospitals and lab inputs, medical technology inputs like 3D we were talking about yesterday. So all those new and emerging areas are actually sitting somewhere here, but they are lost in the jungle of those thousands of tariff lines. As of now, it was really very hard to go through each and every tariff line and try to figure out at a 6-digit level we have just succeeded which tariff lines, which HS2, which HS4 and 6 would be included in a database, could be included possibly in a database on health. And then we worked out that there were, I think, 13 of them. So there it is HS30, 29, 28, 32, 38, 35, 40, 84, 87, 90, and 94 at a broad 4-digit level. And then we've broken it down. We have data bilateral between countries. We've broken it. We've also done it by developing. We've done that bit. And we have for all these tariff lines, and there are 192 tariff lines in the goods sector that we have identified so far. The problem is in health services. As we all understand, as we all know, that there are 4 modes of transport, right? The first mode of transport is cross-border delivery, and this is telemedicine, and this is really becoming increasingly important. Next mode of services is consumption abroad, i.e. patients traveling across borders for diagnosis and treatment, e-tourism. Third mode is commercial presence, and this is establishment of hospitals or clinics through FDI or setting up base for a pharmaceutical company. Fourth, and a very important one, is movement of personnel, which is doctors and nurses practicing in other countries. Now, the problem here is we do not have data on any mode that we are able to find out easily. Possible data sources that we have identified and we are trying to work on are IMF balance of payments, but the problem is it gives data only for services as a whole. It does not break it up by mode 1, 2, 3 and 4. So the challenge is now to go away and find 1, 2, 3, 4. OECD has done some work, and they have done something on e-tourism. And UN Services Trade has data, but again it is all together. We are unable to get our hands, or we are unable to find out how to break it up by different modes. World Bank has some indicators, but it's not really taking us, so we are still trying to find light in the woods. We really don't know how we will go and what will be the time frame. So clearly, we have the impact of trade liberalization in services from the perspective of equity, efficiency, and effectiveness. So effectiveness, you've got access, efficiency in terms of cost and quality of service, and equity. And these are really big areas that we need to start looking at. So I would like to conclude by saying what the new challenges are, what the new context is for the next few years is, one, we have to start talking in terms of global health governance. At the moment we talk about global trade governance, right? That's caught up. But we are not talking anything about global health governance. We are not talking about how the WTO, WHO, WIPO, they're not seeing eye to eye. They are actually not coming up with a concerted action plan because populations are growing, longevity is increasing. So we clearly need to find ways and means of financing health options. In addition to all this, global health governance pattern is going to change because we see, an example is TTIP. You've got discussions going on how health goods and services will, commitments on health goods and services. So that's going to be a big game changer. Next, we have increasing role of NGOs, we've got private actor initiatives. We are also talking about CSR in pharmaceuticals. So far we spoke about CSR in governments, but now we speak about CSR in pharmaceuticals. We talk about access to life-saving drugs, we talk about human rights, and so these are new areas which are developing, and I assume that lots and lots of people are going to be working on this. Another area that so far, there have been a few studies is trying to link health and food, talking about GMOs, obesity. We are working on a paper on how EU policy on sugar can have an impact on obesity. It's still work in progress. So I would like to conclude that health and trade has a very exciting future, and this is really an area that we personally think is something needs a lot of work because we just do not have a database. If any of you have ideas where I can go away and look for data, I'll be very grateful. So thank you so much. I'm sorry I did not give you any academic input because I thought all brains would be dead. So let's think of something new.
Okay, thank you, Sangeeta. So we have some minutes, or I don't know, it depends on your demands. Well, we can open. It's not a matter for me just to try to summarize sometimes a little bit technical in language presentations, not in the methodology, but quite more than technical, specialized, a little bit specialized. Not all the economists or all of us as economists are working on the area of trade and trade agreements and trade negotiations, but there are many topics related with trade, development, aid, health, because health and development are very close, health, development and poverty and trade, prices in international trade of raw materials and commodities. There are many things that are open there, and I think that give us room to put on the table questions from your side. So please go ahead, and Roland is opening the fire.
Okay. It was really great, your presentations, and there was a lot of stuff to digest. But I only want to stress some argument Lars brought it for, that reducing tariffs is not all. And I remember that when I was talking in university, when we were talking about tariffs first time, so it was the German list who said, okay, there are Erziehungszölle or infant industry argument, so that in some way we should protect developing countries and not asking them reduce your tariffs, and so we can come in your markets and bring our goods because we are more productive. So we destroy regional markets very well and very quick. So that's the argument I want to stress. And with health, that's amazing. I give lectures on health economics, but not on international trade. But what I learned, it's not so much the sugar problem, it's for the Americans, let's say, salt problem. They take too much salt, and that's diabetes and all those illnesses what the Americans have is from salt. So Coca-Cola is now without sugar. So they try to do it with less sugar. But these hamburgers are terribly salty.
Saturated.
And
They're full of
that's,
saturated, so it's less salt to raise up its
Salt, transgenic, sorry, Gabriela.
Well, it was very interesting, your presentation, but I was thinking about, I am from a small country in South America, Uruguay, and we were invited last year to participate in the TISA, the Trading Services Agreement, and just our government had decided to go out because they were afraid of some implications in services, of health services, education services, and governmental
services.
yes, buys and yes,
Procurement.
yes, that's it. And there was another issue very important that are in the health, it's medicines, property rights that you know. This is and it prevents many times to sign agreements because with the US, for example, because they are always afraid. And Chilean agreement is always as an example. Oh, Chile has to sign this, so we won't do it. And yes, but it's something that we really don't know how to treat these problems because politically are not they don't accept it. So
Yeah, that's a problem. It is a challenge actually.
yes.
And it's actually just groping for answers. I have so many questions, but frankly, I really do not have the answers myself.
Well, okay. Analyzing the reality is, for us, it's very difficult to have answers also.
Ricky, Alberto, Marina.
Everybody is away.
Lenina, just a question.
Ricky.
All right. Well, the topic of the conference was trade, globalization, and development. And I'm very worried about a very current issue that it is the migration from Syria, particularly here in Germany. How do you think it will influence on general agreements or, generally speaking, on globalization? Because from my point of view, it could be a kind of de-globalization, this migration, because it's a kind of distraction in a part of the world and trying to get more possibilities in another part, but degrading the possibilities finally. What's your opinion for your work?
You can have a conference.
No, let's go more or less answering whoever is just wants to tackle the answer. Yeah, okay.
I completely agree with you. This is a very important problem that we all face, not only Germany, but the European Union, the US, the developed and the developing world. And I think the problem is not here, it's in Syria, and it's in the Middle East. And the international community, they don't really want to afford the real problem where the problem is. And then as long as they don't, the US was before leading those actions in the Middle East and in Central Asia and in Iran, Iraq, but then it didn't go well. And therefore now there is no superpower that is ready to go there and take to act as a leader. And this lack of leadership, I think, is a big problem. And I think it's a very difficult, the solution is very difficult, and the solution is not to stop migrants, this is for sure, because they will come, they will die in the way they have to die, but they will anyway die if they stay there. So I think the German approach is very dangerous, because when Merkel said, you are welcome, and then they were already coming, all of them wanted to come to Germany, and now even more, because of course it's an invitation for them to come. And I think maybe, I don't know if she really valorated what she was saying and the implications of this. I am completely open to migrants and to movements, and I think those are temporary movements as long as the problems are solved there, because all these people, they would like to go back to their countries. Even myself, I'm living in Germany, I have been in Germany for 10 years, but my home country is Spain, and eventually my life, I see my life probably more in Spain than in Germany, and I think this is the case for all migrants. Then migrants, they really want to be in their own country. If they are not there, it's because the problems that are in their countries are not solved. And if you are in a conflict area, you don't have a nice life with your family. And then another aspect that I think is very important is the distinction between economic migrants and migrants coming from conflict areas. This is real discrimination. I'm sorry, but if you are dying because you don't have anything to eat, for me it's the same as if you are dying because there are bombs and conflicts. And then this is again, those are real problems that the international community doesn't want to tackle, and there is not, well, there is a migration organization, but it's not actually working. And then the European Union, the disagreement is huge within the European Union. Is a bad example for the international community. They are not able to deal with the problem. We need a migration policy, which is common migration policy. And as long as we don't have one, then the European Union future is also not very clear. So I think we need a more clear policy in the developed world. We have to give an example to the developing countries, and we are giving a very bad example right now. So I'm very sorry that these things are evolving in this way, even in Spain or in Italy or in Eastern European countries. I know they have their own problems, but I think sometimes we are very short-seen. And we just look at what is happening next door, but we don't care about the global problems. And this is really something we have to care about.
Lars, you wanted to say something? Just on whether we risk globalization and setbacks, etc.
Microphone is not working, I'm listening anything.
And that's better, right?
Yeah.
Just to add that we could risk to some extent progress made in terms of globalization because of migrants coming to Europe. And then I'm not primarily thinking about the migrants themselves, but they're shutting down the Schengen area in the EU, where we have now seen as what they call temporary suspensions of Schengen. And I fear everything that's temporary, because I come from a high-tax country, and where I come from, temporary taxes have never been temporary.
Yes.
Can I add something here? And this is just my opinion. It's a problem which was started off by the US, but it is a heavy price US paid. Just because the EU supported the US at that point in time doesn't mean the EU gets burdened with all the migrants. You see, I think it's a very unfair. It has been very unfair how the whole thing has unfolded, and the whole burden has had to be shared by the EU, because the US is nowhere in the picture at the moment, because US is the country that actually got into this and started everything. Isn't it? They should be sharing this bit as well, and I don't understand why no one talks about it. Well, this is my personal
John keeps the Nobel Prize said that the revolutions in economics were not like in the other sciences. There were more changes of attention or changes in the circumstances. When we look at the effect on the environment, ecological problems, I don't know if we still are waiting for the revolution in economic theory that contemplates these problems. To have something that is the cost of factors, the change in prices, but I don't know if the impact on theory of trade of these new problems, the ecological problems, the fact of the effect on migration and these kind of things. This question is something new in economic theory. We have the old theorems still valid. The gains from trade.
The trade theory applied to the environment, things like that.
Well, the relationship between trade and the environment is very complex. You have this, if you want, this income effect, the technique effect, and the composition effect, and then it's not clear-cut in theory what is the net effect. So is trade good or bad for the environment? This is a question that was asked by Grossman and Kruger already in the 90s, and the answer was apparently it's good. Trade is good for the environment. This is the first answer they gave to the question. Then the subsequent theory, they maybe said that the aspect is very complex, but then most of the results show that this race to the bottom or this pollution heaven argument and so on, they are not very, very important. So it's more important labor cost or other aspects related to comparative advantage. Those are the aspects that really determine trade. And then if trade is good or bad for the environment, I think it's still an open question. Of course, if it increases income and income increases pollution, then of course this is the bad side. But on the other way, when you have a higher income, you demand higher environmental quality, and therefore you will ask for regulations protecting the environment. So this is a counterbalance. And the most recent theories and empirics that are related to the environmental effects show that the technique effect is very important. So the new technologies and all this green growth literature says that basically when you are growing, you are able to produce using cleaner technologies, and therefore pollution automatically, not automatically, but should decrease if you have new regulations protecting the environment. So I am not that pessimistic in this sense. I think the real problem is migration and conflict in the world, and then in some cases globalization is also playing a role in the way conflicts evolve and terrorism and all these networks. So this is a real thing.
I think it is a very complex relationship, and just think about, if we think generally trade, transport, emissions, bad. But what about if production technology is so much more efficient in this foreign country from which we're importing, that if we would produce bananas in Northern Europe, of course we could. We could, but it would be very inefficient and it would be very bad for the environment. Similarly, I think most of us tend to believe that buying local is always good. Yeah, maybe it is. But on the other hand, if you had 50, 60, 70 people driving 10, 15 kilometers locally with their own car to buy their bread or buy their cucumbers, instead of having one truck going around picking stuff up to the local supermarket. I don't know. I'm not saying what's right or wrong, I'm just pointing out some it's not easy. It's a good point.
I was remembering, just I'm going to give you I was remembering and I was looking a thing from the book that I'm sure that many of you have read, that is Paradox of Globalization by Daniel Rodriguez. Well, we are in a moment, let me as a moderator have the freedom to speak just 1 minute. That how easy for us, trade economists, has been to defend free trade, but always in a level of simplicity that Danny Roderick, in some words, in a very short paragraph that I'm going to read to you, just to put a little bit of different approach here. We don't, how we have been able to defend free trade in a simplicity way, but with forgetting something, all the preconditions that we need to accept that to be true. So, as we are now researching and putting more topics related and making more complex analysis of the free trade, then all these conditions come out, and people like Danny Roderick, that is not a protectionist one, of course, they are considering that we have some problems in defending this traditional and shared position of all economics. Let me just read one paragraph. These are the preconditions that one professor of economics puts to the student when he asks for more explanation a part of the comparative advantage idea. The import liberalization must be complete, covering all goods and trade partners, or else the reduction in import restrictions must take into account the potentially quite complicated structure of substitutability and complementarity across restricted commodities. So, in fact, a preferential trade agreement with one or a few trade partners is unlikely to satisfy the requirement. It's true. There must be no microeconomic market imperfections, other than the trade restrictions question, or if there are some, the second-best interactions that are entailed must not be too adverse. Things get complicated. The home economy must be small in world markets, of course, because if it is a big country, we have problems. Or else the liberalization must not put the economy on the wrong side of the optimum tariff. The economy must be in a reasonable full employment, of course, because if not, we have problems. Or if not, the monetary and fiscal authorities must have effective tools of demand management at their disposal. Monetary and fiscal policy now. The income redistributive effects of the liberalization should not be judged undesirable by society at large. Or if they are, there must be compensatory tax transfer schemes with low enough excess burden. There must be no adverse effects on the fiscal balance, or if there are, there must be alternative and expedient ways of making up for the lost fiscal revenue. The liberalization must be politically sustainable and hence credible, so that economic agents don't fear or anticipate a reversal. Wow! Wow! Then, what are the simple arguments for free trade? Any of these conditions, or many of these conditions, are not accomplished in the real world, and then you understand what the situation, how the situation became so complicated when we introduced some elements like employment, environment, and things like that. But well, just was a kind of a kind of parenthesis to say, okay, we are assuming something that is not so simple. Marina, sorry, Marina.
Oh, thank you for reading it. I was thinking about developing countries that want free trade, especially of agricultural products. And I would like not to forget the responsibilities of Europe in all these crises. I was thinking about Irma, who said I would prefer multilateral agreements on labor standards. I don't know which was the meaning, because you didn't say it. I would prefer them because otherwise they can be interpreted as a form of protection. In the sense that we don't care about the labor standards in countries which are not competitors. For example, what happens in sub-Saharan Africa, we don't care. So there are responsibilities in Europe that we often forget. I think that for labor standards in developing countries, it would be, the effect would be much higher of lifting the barriers on the imports of agricultural products than any bilateral treaties on those labor standards, which the countries which are involved say, okay, you did whatever you wanted when you had your economic miracles, etc. Why don't you leave us have our economic miracles, working Saturday, Sunday, 12 years a day, and then we talk when we will be richer. And there are responsibilities, Sangeeta, I think, also about mess in the Middle East, not only of the United States, because in Europe we are used to think that they are the superpower, so they should arrive, settle the things, they should get us free of the Islamic State. The US taxpayers should pay for it, and we continue talking about other things. But if you look at the responsibilities, Europe has huge responsibilities in the Middle East. The United Kingdom, France, and other countries. So my question is, why don't we remember a little bit more that we are involved in all this, and there is a lot of protection of trade in the part of Europe, okay? And that developing countries would like to have a freer world, freer in the sense of trade, okay? Because it would be, for example, think about sugar. We have a huge protection on the true sugar, which is the sugar extracted from sugarcane, and we produce artificial sugar since, I don't know, more than a century. And or we protect bananas. You were saying we cannot produce bananas, but we have a protection on the import of bananas. To protect whom? Why?
Canary Island. We produce bananas.
The two bananas of the Canary Islands.
Madeira?
Kiwi Islands.
And it's also to attract just on the bananas, not only Canary Islands, it's also to protect the so-called ACP bananas. That is bananas from the African Caribbean.
Yeah.
I can say something about the agricultural, the protection of agricultural goods. I think I completely agree, and then just to mention that the China agreement with ASEAN, they include agricultural goods, and actually the effect on trade in agricultural goods is very important, and especially when countries involved are African countries, then I think the first thing to be done is to eliminate protection in agricultural products, and there is already an agreement with Morocco, if I recall
With
well,
Morocco, yes.
that includes agricultural products, and then if you see simply you look at the statistics, they show an increase in trade in those exports from Morocco to the EU just after the agreement. So I think this is something to be done. And there are a lot of standards in goods and agricultural products that have to be fulfilled to enter the European Union. And one of my PhD students from the agricultural department, she's working with the implications of those standards for African countries. And actually, the amount of shipments that go back to Africa because they don't fulfill the standards is huge. So this is another issue. Of course, I agree that we have to protect consumers and to ask for good food standards and so on, but to what extent this is really what we are doing, or this protection, maybe Lars can know much more than myself about this topic, but I think if we want to help developing countries, we have to eliminate protection in the goods in which they are having a comparative advantage.
Yeah, on the labour standards and exports of agricultural products from developing countries, first recall then that all least developed countries have free access to the EU market for agricultural products. There are no exceptions on that. And in most of the agreements we have concluded lately, we also have provisions on sustainable development, including labour rights, etc. But we should also remember, if it's bilateral agreements, we have to agree with our partner. And if the partner country refuses even to discuss anything coming close to labor standards, then it's very difficult from the EU side to impose this, I should say. So I think for some countries in Africa who then say that this is what they want to do and they don't want this, we want this, who are we there to say, no, this is better for you. So it's not always obvious to impose exactly what we think is best for a partner country.
Lenina,
I give up.
you give up.
I think that my question was
Already embraced for us. Okay,
Never give up.
thank you. Daniela.
Well, I wanted to, yes, it's also gets kind of extemporaneous, but I want to raise a point because I think it's important. I did my PhD research on migration, so when I hear all the fears and when you do this research and read a lot and you look at and overlook at all the papers that there are many papers, and you get to the conclusion that labor market effects of there are, I would say, quite limited on wages or on unemployment or on unemployment. So displacement effects are quite limited. There is, yes, a redistribution effect. This is a point that was raised by Norman in 2007, and those owing the productive factors complementary to this new influx, typically capital and skilled labor markets win, and of course earlier migrants and unskilled labor lose. But if you can separate short-run effects from medium and long-run effect, you see that these effects mostly are a short-run effect, but in the medium and long-term effect, it's an increasing growth for the receiving economy. There are even natural experiments documented in the literature. One is the most known is the Mariel Bodleaf in the US. So, of course, we are all worried about this massive influx and what would happen with these economies that are so near. Also, the point that was raised by Angela Merkel, they would have done it anyhow. There is a paper by Julika Steysen that has proved mathematically that there are herd effects, and the most rational, it's called like that, she wrote it in French, well, I would not get the pronunciation, but souvent le troupeau, sinon the herd, it's called the paper. So in case of very limited, that you have to escape from a country where there is war and you have to ask for asylum, you will follow your predecessors, and that's the most rational decision proven mathematically by her. So I think anyhow Germany would have got this influx anyhow without her saying that. So that's politics and not something that would have affected that much the sign of migration flows. I think that the European Union has to focus on containing the short-run effects, but in the long run they would eventually benefit from migration. So probably the concern should be how to deal with this short-run effect and not to worry that much. I don't know. That's my point.
Yes, so I was just thinking about our population in Europe. The European Union is 500 million. 500 million. We are thinking that this is the flow people are arriving now as refugees. If we are thinking about 200,000, we are talking about of 0.06%. But that more or less the same that one person in every average village of 5,000 or 6,000 people. One person. So let's keep calm. Let's keep calm and be efficient in our analysis and ask for the politicians to think a little bit what we are talking about in terms of potential effects in the labor market.
But you must also look at as a dynamic problem. When Merkel said this, the people were already running because it needs 4 weeks to come from Syria to Germany. So you must go to Greece, you must go via Macedonia, you must go to Serbia, you must go to Hungary. So and a lot of those people must walk. So it takes a lot of time to come from Syria to Germany. So the saying of Merkel didn't.
Of course not, but the problem is the social unrest that it generates in Germany. Not that more, maybe the same will come, but then what is happening in Germany and
we must tell people that Sweden does much more than we do.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it is right. I think compared to the population, Sweden receives more migrants than others. But just to follow up on that, I think this is it's more a political problem than an economic problem. And keeping in mind, nobody has said anything about demography. I mean, we have sinking populations in large parts of Europe, and we're going to need an influx of people to sustain our pensions. But I think the short-term election cycle clearly provides long-term concerns like that. But after the Balkan War, when Sweden received a few 100,000 migrants from the Western Balkans, it was, I wouldn't say pure theft, but there were people coming 20, 25 years old, well-educated, didn't cost society a penny or a krona. And they went right into
the labor market.
Right into it. There are always, problems in the beginning, but by and large, but I think it's short and long run.
Marina?
Yeah, well, it's similar, a little bit more specific in the sense that Angela Merkel is not seen as so naive, at least from the British point of view, because they say they have a population which is getting older and older. She is getting educated people, different from the people who arrived to Italy and Spain. They are educated, they are ready to work. They need, in Germany, they need these people because of the pensions for the elder, etc. While, for example, these people are not only educated, they are selected because they have to cross all that difficult path from Syria to Germany. So she's doing a thing which is also not only politically but also economically very sound. From the point of view of Britain, for example, it's not so, it wouldn't be so economically convenient because they have a population that grows, a domestic population which grows, the only one in Europe which really grows. But anyway, for example, The Economist says that the decision of Cameron to go to Syria and go into the refugee camps and take the people from there is not so clever as the decision of Merkel of accepting the people who's already arriving, because she's selecting even more. Okay, so
Self-selection.
Yeah, there is more selection because they are
yes, self-selected.
The riches, the more educated, they are.
They
can't pay for the time. So she's very clever.
Okay, it's 6 o'clock. It's a nice time to finish. Okay, we have half an hour until dinner. So thank you very much for being here all the afternoon. Weather is turning up, and perhaps we have some minutes to walk around and oxygenate a little bit.
Celeste, one moment please, one moment.
Alex, some news from Alex? For some
No, we want to take a photo with the whole roundtable group. So please do not jump and run away. Just stand up.
I'm frozen.
Let me join you. And I have some roundtables for those two participants in the roundtable. The external ones, I'm not able to say, but the special ones who were invited to the roundtable. Small thank you for joining us. Come here and now come closer. It's better. You can jump or you can walk, you can run. But don't hit anybody with that. Looks nice. Here is on the second one.
Sí, está bueno que venga más.
Thank you very much.
Para poder mandarlos.
No. Done.
Der kommt noch. Der Tampon. Wie die zweite City-Tour. Mach nichts. City-Tour. Sie können immer noch ja, ja. Wir haben ja den kleinen ja, an wen denn? Ich kenne ich fotografiere damit Sie das heute ja, damit Sie sich vorbereiten können. Dann streiche ich auch mal bei der türkischen dazu. Türkisch? Ja.
Arnoldshain.
Alex? Hast du Goethe-Uni Briefpapier? Darfst du das benutzen? Und zwar geht's hier um ihren...
For me, where from?
Wir haben doch gesagt, wir machen diese Abschlusszeitung. Keiner machen wir ja so ein Special One.
Es gibt mir keine Chance. Oh, ich habe überhaupt nicht mehr richtig gesagt. Ich wollte leider...
Yeah, she's great.
Not enough.
You said you answer her. Go on.
No, I answer you. Question number 1. What was? I have, yeah.
Are we allowed to?
That's
I don't know, but we will.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
no,
it.
You will get a special one on Goethe paper.
Just on a Goethe paper, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have the text.
Yeah.
Ich habe es ein bisschen geändert.
But you have to read first what I write.
Yeah.
She wrote it.
Ach so, you have extra.
It's just
No problem.
like a template of
yeah,
how they
but
want.
do not use any Greek letters.
No.
Because we do not understand Greek letters.
But you do understand some, right?
Alpha, Omega.
You will learn
Beta.
Beta, everything.
Beta, Gamma.
Delta.
Omega.
You said you have like a
The Greek alphabet, you know, right?
No, my brother can speak Greek, but
He can speak Greek.
yeah, he took the old school and Latin.
So you have some intelligent person? Your father must be intelligent, your brother must be
Yeah, my
intelligent.
father.
You are intelligent.
He's a physicist and for all like writers.
So please say something. What's your mother doing?
Somebody has to take care of
Okay, and what has he done?
Yeah,
Perfect. Clever, she's clever. She's the cleverest of them all.
She knows other things.
My mother. Nein,
Bist du hier?
ja.
Ich gehe mal mit, ja, nicht
Ja, klar. Wer redet?
Ja.
Ja.
Sie haben nämlich mich gefragt.
Ja, klar.
Aber ich habe gesagt, Sie waren noch nicht. Da haben wir jetzt gehört.
We have dinner here at 6:30. And afterwards we have a special education dancing event.
Okay.
So,
I usually fail those classes, but
don't worry. We have the best teacher in the world for this.
okay.
Maybe if you walk
So I should be here.
yeah, and for food.
Yes.
And if you find any guests from girls,
Alex.
was sagen? Para proponer lo siguiente, si quieren. Si nosotros decimos esto se puede hacer, pero lo vamos a proponer. Ja, ja, genau. Ich habe da nicht die ganze versprochen. Ja, genau. Sprecher, was noch nicht kommen.
Also ich wäre beschäftigt mit dem Ziel.
Mach das doch erstmal. Gut. Oh, die Kamera läuft.
Sangeeta?